Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. The sky above was an endless canvas of soft, peachy hues, fading into a dusky purple as the sun descended behind the towering pines of the mountain range. A light breeze fluttered the leaves, and the sounds of the forest, the occasional chirp of a bird, the rustle of an animal in the underbrush filled the air. It was the perfect evening for a hike, or so the hiker Daniel had thought. He had been planning this trip for months, eager for some time away from the city, away from the noise, the chaos. The forest was always where he felt most at peace, and this hike promised the kind of solitude he craved. It wasn't just about the distance or the challenge. It was about reconnecting with nature, resetting his mind, and perhaps finding some clarity in his life. Daniel's boots crunched against the trail, each step echoing in the otherwise serene landscape. His pack felt light on his back, the weight of a few essentials offering a comforting sense of readiness. His eyes drifted upward toward the trees, their towering trunks stretching into the heavens, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. Everything about this hike felt right. The quiet hum of the forest, the crisp air of the mountain evening, the slowly darkening sky, everything was perfect. But as the sun began its final descent, a strange sense of unease crept over him, like a shadow that had settled too close to his heels. He brushed it off as he had done countless times before, chalking it up to the remoteness of the area. Still, the feeling lingered. By the time Daniel reached a small clearing, the sun had completely dipped beneath the horizon, leaving only a fading amber glow on the horizon. He glanced at his watch. 7:15 p.m. Just enough time to set up camp before the full dark of night overtook the forest. The wind had picked up, but the warmth of the day lingered in the air for now. He pitched his tent with practiced ease, setting it beside a shallow stream that trickled gently over smooth stones. The sound of the water added to the calm, and he couldn't help but smile. It had been so long since he'd been in the wild, and even though the unease still tugged at him, the serenity of his surroundings gradually calmed his nerves. As the last of the daylight faded, Daniel unfurled his sleeping bag inside the tent and settled in for the night, pulling the flap tight against the chill. He was hungry but content. He could still hear the hum of the stream and the distant rustling of wind through the trees. The storm, if it was coming, was still hours away. Then came the first sound, a soft, slow crunching of twigs. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, above the rustling of the trees and the babbling stream. But Daniel's body tensed, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. He unzipped the tent slightly, peering out into the dim twilight. Nothing. Just the shifting shadows of the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. He exhaled, trying to shake off the feeling. It was probably just an animal. He had seen deer, tracks along the trail earlier. But the noise persisted. Heavy steps, slow and deliberate, moving in a circle around the camp. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the crunch of leaves underfoot. There was weight to these steps. A person. He grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. The wind had picked up now, howling through the trees, but the air around his camp felt unnervingly still. He swung the light back and forth, illuminating the trees and underbrush. But again, nothing. The clearing was empty, just the damp earth and the swaying pines. His pulse quickened. Could it be someone else out here? Maybe another hiker? He told himself it wasn't impossible, though it felt strange. He hadn't passed anyone on the trail, and the area was remote, too remote for another camper to be nearby. The footsteps continued. Daniel's unease deepened into a simmering knot of fear in his stomach. Every instinct told him to stay inside the tent, to wait it out. But something, the strange pattern of the steps, tugged at him. He wasn't sure if it was the eerily measured rhythm of the movements or the way the steps seemed to grow closer each time he blinked. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was circling him, watching him. After a long minute, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. Daniel waited for what felt like an eternity, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Finally, he forced himself to unzip the tent again, shining his flashlight on the ground. But again, nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. His breath came out in a slow, shaky exhale. It must have been the wind playing tricks on him, he thought. His mind had been racing since he entered the forest. It was nothing. He was imagining things, but just as he began to calm down, something shifted. The footsteps resumed. This time, they were even closer. They circled again, deliberate, measured, almost as if they knew exactly where he was. It was as though the creature, or whatever it was, had been waiting for him to relax. Daniel's blood turned cold. There was no mistake. The steps were close. So close, in fact, that he could feel the weight of them pressing against his chest. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming and brightening erratically. He cursed under his breath, shaking it in his hand. The footsteps didn't stop. They moved in a perfect circle, slower now, as though they were savoring his fear. Suddenly, a branch cracked sharply from just beyond his tent. Daniel froze, his breath stuck in his throat. The hairs on his neck stood on end. The wind was still howling, but this was different. This was deliberate. His heart hammered in his chest as he crept to the opening of the tent. He dared not unzip it fully, not yet. He pressed his ear against the fabric, listening. The footsteps were closer now, much closer, almost right outside. There was no time to think. Without warning, Daniel threw open the flap and bolted out of the tent, flashlight flashing wildly as he sprinted into the woods. His mind raced. Where to go? Which direction? His body ached with the cold, his legs burning, but fear pushed him forward. He didn't care about the trail, didn't care about the path. Just escape. The footsteps followed. Closer and closer they came, growing louder, faster. Whatever was out there was chasing him now. Every crack of the branches, every snap of the underbrush beneath its feet only spurred him forward. He had to make it to safety. He had to get away from whatever was behind him. But then he stumbled. The ground shifted beneath him, and he fell to his knees. He forced himself back up, breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked around in desperation. The forest, once familiar, now seemed twisted, distorted. The trees seemed to loom higher, their branches forming grotesque shapes in the dark. And then something caught his eye. A figure. Standing still at the edge of the trees, Daniel's blood ran cold. It was too dark, too far to make out details. But the figure was there, watching him, watching with those cold, hollow eyes. Before he could move, the footsteps behind him stopped. He turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip, and saw nothing. Only the shifting trees and the inky darkness. The figure was gone, but the silence was unbearable. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as the darkness around him thickened. Something wasn't right. The forest had changed, and he had no idea if he could ever escape. Daniel's breath came in ragged bursts, his heart pounding in his chest as he scrambled through the thick underbrush. His flashlight flickered in and out of existence, offering brief glimpses of the dark forest around him. The wind howled through. The trees, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something older, something unsettling. He didn't stop to catch his breath. Every instinct told him to keep running, to escape whatever was circling him, hunting him. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Had he stumbled upon a dangerous animal, a person lost in the woods, driven mad by the isolation? But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps never ceased. They were too deliberate, too close. As though the being, whatever it was, knew the terrain better than he did. A crack of thunder split the sky, and for a moment, Daniel froze. He looked up, searching for any sign of the storm. The sky, once a calm evening blue, had darkened far too quickly. A thick, unnatural blackness seemed to roll in from all directions, casting an ominous shadow over the forest. The first raindrops hit him like tiny needles, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. Within seconds, he was soaked to the bone, the water streaming down his face and blurring his vision. But still, he ran, blindly pushing through the trees, branches whipping at his skin, roots twisting beneath his feet. The storm was relentless, furious, almost as if nature itself was conspiring against him. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the storm intensified. The wind, once a gentle whisper, now screamed through the trees, rattling the branches and sending leaves flying. The rain came in sheets, so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The forest, once a comforting wilderness, had become a labyrinth of shadows and noise. The trees, towering and oppressive, bent in the wind, their branches creaking like the bones of some ancient creature. Daniel pushed through the darkness, his mind clouded by fear and exhaustion. He had to find shelter. There was no telling how long the storm would last, and he needed to rest, regroup. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not while he was being hunted. Ahead, through the slashing rain, he saw a faint light. A soft glow, barely visible but enough to pull him forward. It could be another camper, or perhaps a ranger's cabin. Either way, it was his only chance. He stumbled toward it, the flashlight barely illuminating his path, the storm roaring in his ears. The light grew brighter, closer, until Daniel realized it wasn't coming from a cabin at all. It was a clearing, an abandoned campsite, its fire, long extinguished, but the remains of a shelter, perhaps a tarp or an old tent, lay haphazardly in the middle. A small fire pit sat in the center, the charred remains of wood still smoldering. Relief washed over him for a split second. He wasn't alone. There was a sign of life, of human presence, even if it was an old, long-forgotten one. He rushed to the clearing, his body trembling with both cold and fear. As he moved closer, his foot struck something hard, a rock perhaps, and he fell to the ground with a loud thud. His flashlight bounced out of his grip and rolled a few feet away, its beam landing on something that made his blood run cold. It was a footprint, a large, muddy print, the outline of a boot, and it was still fresh. The breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned to look around the clearing. The footsteps. They had followed him. They had led him here. With trembling hands, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and crawled toward the remains of the fire pit, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. But just as his fingers brushed against the edge of a discarded pot, he froze. There, in the flickering light of his flashlight, stood the figure. It was a silhouette at first, barely discernible against the dark background of the trees. But as the wind shifted, the rain briefly parted, revealing the full form, a tall, gaunt figure cloaked in darkness, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Its outline seemed to waver and shift, like it was made of shadows themselves. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His mind raced. Was this another person? A hunter? But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. The same eerie, deliberate stillness he had felt when the footsteps circled his camp. A chill ran down his spine, and he knew deep down that this was no ordinary hiker. The figure stepped forward, its footfall eerily silent despite the rain-soaked ground. It was as if it was gliding through the forest, unfazed by the storm, untouched by the mud that should have clung to its form. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a shadow detached from the earth. Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing his flashlight, but before he could shine the beam at the figure, the light flickered and died. The figure was now standing mere feet from him. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice cracked as he spoke, his words drowned out by the wind. But there was no reply, no answer. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, its body covered in dark, tattered clothing that seemed to blend into the night. Suddenly, the figure's head tilted, its movement slow, deliberate. Daniel's heartbeat thudded in his ears as he instinctively took a step back, fear creeping into his bones. There was something ancient about this being, something that made his skin crawl. The figure's lips parted, but instead of words, low, guttural whisper filled the air, as though the very trees around them were murmuring secrets to each other. The voice was hollow, far off, and yet it felt impossibly close. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered. Daniel's stomach churned as he stumbled backward, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. The storm roared louder, the winds howling, as if echoing the figure's warning. But as he turned to flee, the world around him seemed to shift again. The rain wasn't just falling, it was swirling, rising, encircling him, as though the forest itself had come alive. The figure moved forward, and in its wake, the air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on him. His vision blurred and panic surged. He had to leave, had to get away. But his feet refused to move. The footsteps, the figure, they were closing in again. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the storm, leaving Daniel standing alone in the clearing. The footsteps, though, continued just as they had before, but now they were not alone. The figure was gone, but the chill remained. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest as the rain pelted down around him. His body, still frozen from the encounter, trembled with exhaustion and fear. The forest felt wrong. It had always been a place of peace for him, a retreat from the noise of the world. But now it felt oppressive. The trees leaned too closely, their long limbs casting jagged, unnatural shadows in the flickering flashlight beam. His mind raced. He had to get control of himself. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions, especially not now when he was completely alone in the middle of a storm. But no matter how hard he tried, the events of the past hour kept looping through his mind like a relentless nightmare. The footsteps, the shadowy figure, the strange voice, and the sickening sense that something was watching him, always watching, even now. With shaking hands, Daniel gathered his things. He needed to get away, to find a place to hide. But there was no escaping the feeling that the forest had already claimed him. There was nowhere to go. Still, he forced his legs to move, the thick mud beneath his boots sucking at his feet as he stumbled toward the only semblance of safety he could find. A small cluster of trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, offering some shelter from the storm. As he reached the trees, he paused, taking in the surroundings. The forest here was denser, the canopy thicker, casting a shadow over the ground, even though it was still early evening. The sound of the rain crashing through the leaves above drowned out all other noise, but Daniel felt the oddest sensation, as if the air itself had changed. It felt heavier here, like the atmosphere had thickened, and every breath seemed more difficult to take. He shook his head, trying to push the feeling aside. He couldn't afford to be paranoid, not now, not when he needed to think clearly. He started to set up camp under the trees, moving quickly, but his movements were stiff, mechanical. The sooner he got settled, the sooner he could sleep and figure out what to do next. But the wind continued to whip through the trees, making it difficult to secure his tent. His fingers fumbled with the stakes, his mind distracted by the echoing footsteps that still seemed to follow him. The unease gnawed at him, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking in the rain. But when he turned, the forest was empty, its dark expanse stretching out in all directions. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand, finally managing to get the tent staked down. The gusts of wind were relentless, and he hurriedly crawled inside, zipping the flap tight behind him. The safety of the tent felt fragile, like a thin barrier between him and the unknown forces outside. Inside, he was shielded from the worst of the storm. But the discomfort lingered, gnawing at him. The ground beneath him was damp, and the air felt thick with moisture. He tried to settle into the sleeping bag, but his mind refused to quiet. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure, the way it had stood there, silent and motionless. The sound of its whisper still echoed in his ears. "You shouldn't be here." He closed his eyes, willing himself to calm down. But then, out of nowhere, the first sound reached him. Quiet, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, just like before. Daniel's eyes snapped open, his body rigid with fear. He immediately unzipped the tent slightly, shining his flashlight out into the darkened clearing. The light flickered, casting weak beams through the rain. There was nothing. Just the distant rustle of the trees in the wind. His heart began to race. Was he imagining it? No. The footsteps were real. They were circling his camp again, just as they had the night before. The same slow, methodical pace. The same unnerving rhythm. His hands trembled as he clutched the flashlight tighter, the beam cutting through the downpour. But again, there was nothing. No one. Only the rustling of the trees and the crashing of rain. For a moment, Daniel almost convinced himself he was just paranoid, that the storm and his nerves were playing tricks on him. But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, he knew it wasn't his mind. It was real. The forest had come alive around him, closing in on him from all sides, and then, just as before, the sound stopped. The silence was unbearable. It felt as though the forest itself had drawn in a breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears as he scanned the trees, but he couldn't see anything. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted in the shadows. The footsteps, the presence, it was gone. But as the minutes dragged on, the unease only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him from the darkness. He forced himself to lie back down, pulling the covers tighter around himself, hoping that if he just closed his eyes and ignored it, it would go away. But as he lay there in the oppressive silence of the night, his mind couldn't rest. Every small sound, every shift in the wind made him jump. Every creak of the tent felt like a warning, and then in the stillness, he heard something even worse, a whisper so soft that at first he thought it was just the wind, but then the whisper grew louder, sharper. "Don't go to sleep," Daniel's eyes shot open, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was coming from inside his tent, not from the wind, not from outside. The words were clear, unmistakable, chilling in their simplicity. "Don't go to sleep." His heart raced as he sat up in the tent, scanning the darkness with wide eyes. There was no one there, no figure, no movement, only the empty forest beyond. But the voice, he couldn't deny it. The voice had been right there, as if someone was standing just inches from him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts that threatened to overtake him. He was alone in the forest. There was no one else here. But even as he tried to calm, his frantic thoughts, the footsteps returned. Slow, measured, purposeful. They moved closer again, until they were right outside his tent, circling. The rain had softened slightly, but the tension in the air had grown thicker. The footsteps weren't just surrounding him. They were closing in. Daniel's breath hitched, his throat tight with panic. His hand fumbled for his flashlight, but as he reached for it, the beam flickered again, flickered, and then died entirely. The footsteps stopped, and in that moment of silence, something else broke through the oppressive quiet, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, steady, too close. A shadow flickered just outside the tent, and Daniel's blood ran cold. He had never felt this kind of fear in all his years of hiking. This wasn't just nature. This wasn't just an animal or a person. This was something ancient. Something that had been here long before he had arrived, and it was claiming its territory. And just as his hand reached for the zipper of the tent, a voice, not his own, whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't be here. It's too late now." Daniel's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that echoed in his ears as he lay frozen inside the tent, the voice still echoing in his mind. "You shouldn't be here." The words lingered, sharp and unrelenting, like a curse spoken just for him. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the air was thick, stifling with an unnatural heaviness, as though something was waiting for him to make a mistake. He didn't dare unzip the tent again. The oppressive silence that followed felt worse than any noise, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching. Daniel clutched the flashlight in his trembling hand, its light useless now, flickering intermittently. The rain outside had slowed to a light drizzle, but the feeling of dread remained, as if the storm had changed something deep within the forest. Then, the ground beneath him shifted. At first, it was just a subtle sensation, a soft tremor beneath the tent floor, like a distant rumble. But the feeling quickly grew stronger, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The air, too, had changed, damp, stagnant, as if the forest had swallowed all the life, all the sound, leaving only an eerie quiet. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He tried to push himself up, but his body was sluggish, as though it were resisting him. His limbs felt heavy, weighed down, the fear anchoring him to the ground. Then, it happened. A sudden violent rush of water erupted beneath the tent. The ground seemed to buckle under him, and in an instant, the tent was flooded. The water rushed in, rising rapidly, as if it were alive, eager to consume everything in its path. The once dry earth beneath him turned to mud, the floodwaters swirling around his legs as they climbed higher and higher. Daniel scrambled to his feet, panic surging through him. His flashlight flickered and died as the water reached his ankles, then his knees. The flood wasn't just water. It was cold, unnatural, and thick with something that didn't belong. It wasn't rainwater or a simple flash flood. It was as if the forest itself had opened its mouth and was swallowing everything whole. He could hear it now, the murmurs, the whispers from below the surface rising with the water. The voices were faint at first, but as the water surged higher, they grew louder, clearer, as if they were coming from within the earth itself. He strained to make out the words, but they were too jumbled, too distorted. Then just above the rising tide, he heard something else, a footstep. No, not a footstep. A heavy thud, like something large had stepped into the water. The sound was followed by another and another, until they came in a steady, methodical rhythm, echoing from the edges of the forest. Daniel turned, his eyes scanning the trees, the mist that rose from the floodwaters clouding his vision. His breath caught as he saw the shadow, a shape moving between the trees, its silhouette impossibly tall and dark against the rising tide. It was the same figure from before, the one that had haunted him since the storm began. His mind raced. He had to get out. He had to escape the water, escape the forest, before whatever that thing was reached him. But the water was relentless. It surged higher, the current strong enough to pull him forward. Panic surged as the water reached his waist, then his chest, and finally, just as his knees buckled under the weight of it, it flooded over his head. He gasped, choking on the cold, thick liquid that surrounded him. The whispers were everywhere now, swirling around him like a storm of voices, growing louder, more frantic. With one final desperate breath, Daniel pushed against the current, fighting to get his head above water. He managed to gasp for air, only to find himself pulled down again, deeper into the flood, into the cold embrace of the forest that seemed to be swallowing him whole. He reached out blindly, his hands grasping at the wet ground, the soft, muddy earth offering no purchase. The water was thick now, almost viscous, as if the forest itself had bled into it. The flood had become something more, an entity unto itself, alive with the malevolent energy of the land. And then, just as the water seemed to drag him under completely, the floodwaters receded. The suddenness of the change left Daniel gasping for air, coughing and choking as the water drained away from him. The world was quiet again, too quiet. The forest had stilled, and the trees that had once seemed so oppressive now loomed in silence. Daniel's head spun. The flood had come and gone in mere moments, leaving behind only wet soil and the eerie silence of the woods. He scrambled to his feet, shaking, disoriented. His clothes were soaked, the chill of the water seeping into his bones. He couldn't make sense of what had just happened. How could the forest do that? The whispers had stopped, but the stillness was deafening. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he turned slowly in a circle, trying to make sense of the landscape. Everything looked different. The trees, the path, the clearing, all of it had shifted. The forest seemed to have rearranged itself, the space that had once been a familiar campsite, now an alien, unknowable place. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, he saw it again, the figure. But this time, it wasn't moving. It was waiting. Daniel's heart clenched in his chest. He didn't know how much more he could take. The forest was alive with something ancient and vengeful. The flood had been a warning, just a taste of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. The figure watching him was part of this, an unholy presence that had risen from the earth itself. He didn't know if he could outrun it. With trembling hands, Daniel picked his way through the forest, the water still pooling around his feet, the trail obscured by the shifting trees. He had no choice but to keep moving. If he stopped, if he let the dread overwhelm him, he would be lost. This place, this forest, it had already claimed something, and if he wasn't careful, it would claim him too. The flood was only the beginning. The rain had finally stopped, but the air remained thick with the remnants of the storm. Daniel's body was soaked through, his clothes clinging to his skin as he moved deeper into the forest. His senses felt distorted, as if the world around him had become muffled, wrapped in an eerie silence that made his every movement feel like an intrusion. The shadows in the forest had shifted once more. The trees, which once felt like silent sentinels, now seemed to close in on him with malevolent intent. Every rustling leaf, every creak of the branches above felt amplified, unnatural. He could feel eyes on him, though when he glanced over his shoulder there was no one there. The hairs on his neck prickled, a sense of being followed settling like a weight in his chest. He wasn't alone. The feeling was impossible to shake, but Daniel forced himself to move forward. The faint whispers had returned, soft at first, like the wind catching the leaves, but they were quickly growing clearer. His mind raced. The footsteps, those heavy, deliberate steps, had stopped, but the voices remained. Unsettling, desperate voices that seemed to be calling to him, beckoning him towards something he couldn't yet understand. "Help us." The voice was faint, distant, but it chilled him to the bone. It didn't sound like any human voice he had ever heard before. The words were sharp, echoing in his mind, filling him with a sickening dread. Daniel's stomach churned as he stumbled forward, his flashlight flickering and dimming in his trembling hand. He reached for the beam, but it died completely, leaving him in the utter darkness of the forest. Don't look back. The warning whispered through his mind like a distant memory, a voice that wasn't his own. His pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as his instincts screamed at him to turn and run. But something kept him moving forward. The voices, there was something in them that pulled at him, like an invisible thread tethering him to this cursed place. He couldn't ignore it. "Help us." The whisper sounded closer now. It was not coming from the trees, nor from the wind. It was coming from the ground, from beneath the earth itself. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as his feet carried him forward against his will. The forest was alive in ways he couldn't explain. The whispers were becoming clearer, louder, until they crescendoed into a scream. "Help us!" The sound of the scream shattered the air like 1,000 voices, crying out in agony. Daniel froze, his body paralyzed with terror. The world around him seemed to warp, the trees distorting as if they were bending and twisting in pain. The ground beneath him cracked, and from those cracks, a thick, viscous darkness began to rise. It was as though the forest itself was bleeding, its very essence spilling out onto the earth, consuming everything in its path. He had to get out. With no more hesitation, Daniel bolted. He didn't care where he was running. He just needed to escape the horrific sounds that were now reverberating through the trees. The whispers of the forest rose, filling the space around him. But as he ran, the shadows seemed to stretch farther, elongating into grotesque shapes that mirrored his movements. The trees themselves groaned and creaked, as though something ancient and terrible was awakening deep within the forest. And then in the distance, he saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement between the trees. But as he drew closer, the figure solidified into something more. An apparition, a pale, tattered figure standing motionless in the center of a small clearing, its form partially illuminated by the weak light of the moon. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes wide with terror, yet frozen in an expression of despair. Her body was covered in mud, her tattered clothes clinging to her emaciated frame. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. But it was the woman's eyes that held him captive. They were wide, unblinking, staring directly at him with an emptiness that seemed to peer into the depths of his soul. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural moan filled the air, a sound that was more sorrowful than terrifying. Her lips moved again, but the words were lost in the wind. The sound of her mourning reverberated through the forest, a warning, an echo of the voices that had been calling to him. Suddenly, Daniel's feet moved without his consent. It was as though the forest was pulling him toward the figure, dragging him closer despite every instinct in his body telling him to turn away. He tried to stop himself, but his body ignored him, propelling him forward toward the ghostly woman. His mind screamed for him to stop, to run, but the forest around him seemed to constrict, the trees closing in, forcing him forward. The air grew colder with each step, the whispers louder, urging him on. He was drowning in the sound, drowning in the weight of something ancient, something tragic. As he approached the woman, the ground beneath him shifted once more. The earth seemed to give way, cracks spreading through the forest floor as if it were being consumed by something unseen. The woman's face twisted, her lips contorting into a grin that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. At the far end of the parking lot, under the